Picture this. It's 1950. American women can't get credit cards without their husband's permission. They can't serve on juries in most states. Many can't even keep their own paychecks. Banks won't give them loans. Employers can legally fire them for getting pregnant. This is America, the land of the free in 1950. Now, rewind over 1,000 years to the Viking Age, around 800 to 1000 AD. These so-called barbarians from Scandinavia, the raiders, the pillagers, the brutal warriors, surely their women had it worse, right? Wrong. Dead wrong. Viking women could own property. They could divorce abusive husbands. They ran businesses. They inherited wealth. They had legal protection. They controlled their own money. And they could do all of this without asking permission from any man. Today, I'm going to prove to you that women in Viking society over 1,000 years ago had rights and freedoms that American women didn't achieve until the 1960s, 70s, and in some cases, the 1980s. And the evidence is going to blow your mind. Let's start with the most fundamental right, property ownership. In Viking society, women could own land, houses, livestock, ships, and businesses, completely independent of their fathers or husbands. When a Viking woman married, she didn't become her husband's property, she kept her own possessions. Archaeological evidence proves this beyond doubt. When archaeologists excavate Viking women's graves, they consistently find one particular item: keys. Not just any keys, large ornate keys worn on chains as jewelry. These weren't decorative, they were symbols of power. The keys to the household, to storage rooms, to treasure chests. The woman of the house literally held the keys to the kingdom. But here's what makes this remarkable. These weren't just ceremonial. Legal documents and sagas from the Viking Age show that women actively managed estates, controlled household finances, and made major economic decisions. A Viking woman named Odd the Deep-Minded, after her husband and son died, personally led an expedition to Iceland, claimed land, distributed it to her followers, and founded a dynasty. She did all of this as a woman, and no one questioned her right to do so. Now, fast forward to 1950s America. Married women in most states couldn't own property separately from their husbands. If a woman inherited money or land, it legally became her husband's. If she bought something with her own earnings, he could claim ownership. Women couldn't get mortgages or business loans without a male cosigner, usually their husband or father. This didn't fully change until the Equal Credit Opportunity Act of 1974. That's right, 1974. Viking women had property rights in the year 800 that American women didn't secure until 1974. That's an 1174-year gap. Now let's talk about marriage and divorce. And this is where things get really interesting. In Viking society, both men and women could initiate divorce, and they didn't need anyone's permission to do it. Not a church, not a court, not the government. The process was remarkably straightforward. A woman who wanted to divorce her husband would gather witnesses, usually neighbors or family members, and make a formal declaration at the door of her home and again at the local assembly called the Thing. She would state her reasons for divorce, and that was essentially it. The marriage was dissolved. What could a Viking woman divorce her husband for? The sagas and law codes give us specific examples. If he struck her 3 times, if he was too poor to support the household, if he dressed in women's clothing, which violated gender norms, if he exposed her breasts without permission, if he was impotent, if he abandoned her, or simply if she was unhappy with the marriage. And here's the crucial part. When a Viking woman divorced, she took her property with her. Remember that dowry she brought into the marriage? She got it back. Any wealth she accumulated during the marriage, hers to keep. She could walk away financially independent. There's a famous example in the Laxdæla saga of a woman named Gudrun Ósvífursdóttir who divorced her husband because she didn't like the shirts he wore. She thought they were too feminine. She declared the divorce, took her property, and remarried. No one stopped her. Now let's look at 1950s America. In most states, divorce required proving fault, adultery, cruelty, desertion, or abandonment, and even then, it wasn't easy. Women who divorced often lost everything. Courts favored men in property division. Women couldn't get credit to start over. Society shamed divorced women as failures. No-fault divorce, where you could divorce simply because the marriage wasn't working, didn't become available in most American states until the 1970s and 1980s. California introduced it in 1969. New York didn't allow no-fault divorce until 2010. That's right, 2010. A Viking woman in the year 850 could divorce her husband because she didn't like his shirts. An American woman in 1950 might be trapped in an abusive marriage because she couldn't prove fault in court. Think about that. Let's talk about work and money, because this is where Viking women really shine. While their husbands were off raiding, trading, or warring, which could be months or even years at a time, Viking women ran everything. And I mean everything. They managed farms that could employ dozens of workers. They oversaw livestock, crop production, textile manufacturing, food storage, and household finances. They made decisions about buying and selling goods, hiring workers, and making investments. When the men returned, they reported to their wives about the state of the household. But it goes beyond just managing the home front. Archaeological evidence shows that Viking women were active in trade and commerce. We found women's graves with scales, weights, and foreign coins, the tools of merchants and traders. Some women traveled on trading expeditions. Others ran shops and markets. One of the most profitable industries in Viking society was textile production, making cloth, clothing, and sails for ships. This was dominated by women, and it made some of them very wealthy. A high-quality wool cloak or linen sail could be worth as much as a cow or more. Women controlled this entire industry, from sheep raising to spinning to weaving to selling the final product. There's archaeological evidence of women who were clearly wealthy in their own right. Graves filled with silver, jewelry, exotic imports, and luxury goods, buried with women, not their husbands. These weren't gifts from men. These were fortunes these women earned and controlled themselves. Now compare this to 1950s America. Yes, women worked, but their options were severely limited. Teaching, nursing, secretarial work, these were considered appropriate female jobs. But married women faced enormous pressure to quit working once they had children. Many employers had policies requiring women to resign when they got married or pregnant. And here's the real kicker. Even when women worked, they often couldn't control their own paychecks. In many states, a husband had legal rights to his wife's earnings. She earned the money, but he could legally take it, spend it, or control it. It wasn't until the 1960s and 1970s that laws changed to guarantee women's right to their own wages and to prohibit employers from discriminating based on sex or marital status. The Equal Pay Act wasn't passed until 1963, and it's still not fully enforced today. A Viking woman in the year 900 could divorce her husband because she didn't like his shirts. An American woman in 1950 might be trapped in an abusive marriage because she couldn't prove fault in court. Think about that. Let's talk about legal rights, because this is where things get even more surprising. Viking women had significant legal standing in their society. They could represent themselves in court, they could bring lawsuits, they could testify, and they could seek legal remedies for wrongs done to them. The Viking legal system centered around local assemblies called things, outdoor gatherings where free men, and some women, would come together to settle disputes, make laws, and render judgments. While men dominated these assemblies, women could attend, women could speak, and women could bring cases. We have records of women successfully suing for property disputes, demanding compensation for injuries, and seeking justice for crimes committed against them or their families. A Viking woman named Aud Djuputka, Aud the Deep-Minded, was so respected that after settling in Iceland, she held her own assembly to distribute land to her followers. She functioned as a chieftain. Women could also act as legal guardians for children, manage estates on behalf of minor heirs, and make binding legal contracts. If a woman's husband died, she didn't automatically lose control of the estate. She could manage it, make decisions about it, and pass it on to her children. Now let's talk about 1950s America. Women couldn't serve on juries in many states. They were considered too emotional, too fragile, or simply not appropriate for the task. Mississippi didn't allow women on juries until 1968. Louisiana held out until 1975. Women's testimony in court was often given less weight than men's, especially in cases involving property or business. Married women couldn't enter into legal contracts without their husband's consent in many jurisdictions. If a woman wanted to start a business, buy a car, or make any major transaction, she needed her husband's signature. Think about this. A Viking woman in 900 AD could stand before the Thing assembly and argue her own legal case. An American woman in 1950 couldn't serve on the jury hearing that case. Now let's talk about inheritance, because this reveals something fascinating about how Viking society valued women's economic independence across generations. In Viking law, sons typically inherited more than daughters. I won't sugarcoat that. Viking society wasn't perfectly equal. But here's the crucial difference. Daughters did inherit. They had a legal right to a portion of their parents' estate. They could inherit land, wealth, livestock, ships, and businesses. Even more importantly, a woman's inheritance was hers alone. When she married, it didn't automatically become her husband's property. It remained hers. If she had children and died, it passed to her children, not to her husband's family. This created generational wealth for women within their own family lines. There are documented cases of Viking women inheriting substantial estates and managing them independently for decades. Some women inherited from multiple family members and became quite powerful as a result. And if a woman had no brothers, she could inherit everything, the entire family estate. This happened often enough that we have numerous examples in the sagas and archaeological record of women who were substantial landowners and leaders in their communities. Now look at 1950s America, and even earlier. Under the legal doctrine of coverture, which wasn't fully abolished in all states until the mid-20th century, a married woman's property became her husband's upon marriage. If her parents died and left her an inheritance, it legally belonged to her husband. If a woman married died, her property often went to her husband rather than to her children or her own family. A widow might inherit from her husband, but she often had limited rights to sell or manage that property without oversight. Some states had laws restricting what property a woman could bequeath in her will. She couldn't necessarily leave her possessions to whoever she wanted. The law dictated that certain property had to go to male heirs. The irony is painful. A Viking woman in the year 900 could inherit wealth from her father, keep it separate from her husband's property, manage it independently, and pass it on to her own children according to her wishes. An American woman in 1950 might inherit money from her parents and immediately lose control of it to her husband. Now we need to talk about something that might surprise you even more: bodily autonomy and consent. Viking law had specific protections for women's physical autonomy that were remarkably progressive for their time, and in some ways more protective than 20th century American law. Viking law codes specifically prohibited sexual assault and had severe penalties for it. A man who assaulted a woman could be outlawed, essentially exiled from society, stripped of legal protection, and anyone could kill him without consequence. This was one of the harshest punishments in Viking society. The laws were also specific about consent. There are provisions about inappropriate touching, about exposing a woman's body without permission, about forced marriage. A woman could not be forced to marry against her will. Both parties had to consent to the marriage. Remember that divorce provision I mentioned earlier? A woman could divorce her husband if he exposed her breasts without permission. This was considered a violation of her bodily autonomy serious enough to dissolve a marriage. Even in warfare and raiding, where Vikings definitely committed atrocities, there were cultural expectations about treatment of women. The sagas record instances where men were punished or shamed for violating women, even enemy women. The culture had standards. Now, 1950s America. Marital rape wasn't recognized as a crime in any U.S. state until the 1970s. Most states didn't criminalize it until the 1980s and 1990s. Some states didn't fully close the marital rape exemption until the 2000s. The legal theory was that marriage constituted ongoing consent, that a woman, by marrying, had given permanent consent to sexual relations with her husband. She couldn't withdraw that consent. She had no legal recourse if her husband forced her. Sexual harassment in the workplace wasn't recognized as a legal violation until the 1970s. A woman couldn't sue her employer or coworkers for unwanted sexual advances, touching, or propositions. It was just considered part of working life. So, a Viking woman in 850 AD had legal recourse if someone violated her bodily autonomy and could divorce a husband who disrespected her physical boundaries. An American woman in 1950 had no legal protection against sexual assault by her own husband. Let's talk about something that doesn't get enough attention: education and knowledge. While formal schools didn't really exist in Viking society the way we think of them, there's compelling evidence that Viking women had access to knowledge and literacy. We have rune stones, those carved stone monuments that Vikings left across Scandinavia that were commissioned by women, carved for women, and in some cases, possibly carved by women. Runestones that say things like, Gerlog had this bridge built in memory of her daughter, or Estrid had these runes carved for her husband. These weren't just decorative. Runes were used for communication, record-keeping, and magic. Women who could read and write runes had access to power, the power to preserve memory, to communicate across distances, to participate in religious practices. We also have evidence of women as healers, herbalists, and vulvas, seeresses who practiced a form of Norse shamanism. These weren't just superstitious practices. They required extensive knowledge of herbs, astronomy, psychology, and oral tradition. These women were respected specialists, and their knowledge was valued and sought after. Women passed down family histories, poems, and sagas through oral tradition. When these were finally written down centuries later, they acknowledged that women had been the keepers of these stories. Knowledge wasn't restricted by gender. Compare this to 1950s America, where women were actively discouraged for higher education in many fields. Medical schools, law schools, and engineering programs had quotas limiting female enrollment, usually around 5% or less. Harvard Business School didn't admit women until 1963. Princeton didn't admit female undergraduates until 1969. Yale held out until 1969 as well. Women who did pursue education were often steered toward appropriate fields: teaching, nursing, home economics. They were told that too much education would make them unattractive to men, that it would damage their ability to have children, that it was a waste because they'd just get married anyway. A Viking woman in the year 900 could learn runes, practice healing arts, and become a respected religious specialist. An American woman in 1950 might be denied admission to law school because of her gender. Now let's talk about what happened when a woman's husband died, because this reveals a lot about women's structural power in society. In Viking society, widows often became extremely powerful. When a woman's husband died, she didn't lose control of the household or the estate. She became the head of the family. She made all the decisions. She managed all the property. She could choose to remarry or remain single. That was entirely her choice. Some of the most powerful figures in Viking society were widows. Odd the Deep-Minded, who I mentioned earlier, became one of the most important settlers of Iceland after her husband and son died. She commanded respect as a leader, not despite being a widow, but because she had proven her capabilities. Wealthy widows were highly desirable marriage partners because they came with property, resources, and proven management skills. But they couldn't be forced to remarry. A widow who preferred to remain independent could do so, and she retained full control of her property. Archaeological evidence shows us graves of elderly women buried with symbols of wealth, authority, and household management. the keys, the weighing scales, the expensive jewelry. These were women who lived long lives with sustained power and independence. The sagas tell us of widows who ran estates for decades, who made major political alliances, who arranged marriages for their children, who even led military ventures. Freydis Eriksdotter, daughter of Eric the Red, led an expedition to Vinland, North America. When conflicts arose, she personally fought and intimidated the men who challenged her. She was a widow when she did this. Now, 1950s America. Widows often faced immediate financial disaster. Because property was usually titled in the husband's name, and because women often didn't have independent credit, a widow might find herself unable to access bank accounts, unable to get loans, unable to maintain the home. Many widows were forced to rely on charity from male relatives or the church. Social Security for widows existed, but the benefits were often insufficient. Many widows had to find work despite having no recent job experience and facing age and sex discrimination. The cultural expectation was that women would be taken care of by sons or brothers. They weren't expected to be independent. A widow who tried to maintain independence was seen as strange or pitiable. So a Viking widow in the year 900 could inherit her husband's estate, run it independently, and command respect as a household leader. An American widow in 1950 might lose access to her own home because the bank account was in her dead husband's name. Now here's the question we need to ask. Why did Viking society give women these rights? And why did 1950s America, a modern democratic nation, restrict women so severely? The answer reveals something profound about how societies value women's contributions. Viking society was practical above all else. They lived in harsh environments where survival required everyone's contribution. When men left for months or years to raid or trade, someone had to keep society functioning. Women ran farms, managed resources, made economic decisions, and maintained social order. The society literally couldn't function without women having real power and authority. Vikings also had a cultural belief in strong female figures. Their mythology was full of powerful goddesses and female beings. Freya, the goddess of love and war, the Valkyries, who chose who lived and died in battle, the Norns, who controlled fate itself. Women having power wasn't strange to them. It was woven into their worldview. Additionally, Viking society valued competence over gender ideology. If a woman could run an estate effectively, lead an expedition successfully, or manage trade profitably, why would you stop her? That would be wasteful. Viking society couldn't afford to waste talent based on gender. Compare this to 1950s America. After World War II, when women had proven they could work in factories, serve in the military, and manage households alone, there was a massive cultural push to get women back into domestic roles exclusively. It wasn't because women couldn't do the work. They just demonstrated they could. It was ideological. The 1950s ideal of the suburban housewife wasn't based on women's capabilities. It was based on a specific vision of social order, family structure, and gender roles that was seen as morally correct and stabilizing. Women's restrictions weren't about protecting women. They were about maintaining a particular social structure. The legal restrictions on women's property rights, credit access, and economic independence weren't accidents. They were deliberate choices designed to keep women dependent on men, which was seen as the natural and proper order of things. Here's the painful irony. The barbaric Vikings gave women legal and economic rights because it was practical and made their society function better. Civilized 1950s America restricted women's rights based on ideology about how society should be structured, regardless of whether it actually made sense. Now, before we finish, I need to be completely honest about something. Viking society was not a feminist utopia. Let me be crystal clear about the limitations and problems. Viking women couldn't hold political office. They couldn't be chieftains in their own right, with very rare exceptions. They couldn't participate fully in the Thing assemblies. The society was still fundamentally patriarchal. Men held most formal power. Sons inherited more than daughters. Male heirs were preferred. A woman's social status was often tied to her father's or husband's status. Women were still expected to primarily manage households, even if they had broader rights. Viking raids absolutely involved violence against women. Enslavement was real. Sexual violence happened. The sagas and archaeological evidence don't hide this. Vikings captured and enslaved women from other cultures, and those enslaved women had none of the rights I've been describing. And let's be clear, these rights I've described applied to free women of a certain social class. Enslaved women, poor women, and foreign women had far fewer protections. So why am I making this comparison if Viking society wasn't perfect? Because perfect is the enemy of good, and because context matters. The point isn't that Viking society was better than 1950s America in every way. The point is that specific legal and economic rights that we think of as modern achievements, property ownership, divorce rights, economic independence, bodily autonomy, existed over 1,000 years ago in a society we often dismiss as primitive and barbaric. This comparison forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Progress isn't linear. Rights aren't inevitable. Societies don't automatically become more equal over time. The arc of history doesn't bend toward justice on its own. Viking women lost many of these rights when Scandinavia converted to Christianity in the 10th and 11th centuries. The Christian church brought different ideas about women's roles, marriage, and property. Many of the rights Viking women had enjoyed were gradually stripped away as Christian law replaced Norse custom. Women's rights can go backward. They have gone backward multiple times in history. The 1950s restrictions on American women weren't some holdover from primitive times. They were relatively recent impositions, many dating to the Victorian era and early 20th century. This means we can't take our rights for granted. Every generation has to actively protect and expand rights or risk losing them. So here's what we've learned. Viking women in the year 800 to 1000 AD could own property independently, divorce at will, control their own earnings, inherit wealth, represent themselves legally, and maintain bodily autonomy. American women in 1950 struggled to access credit, couldn't serve on juries in many states, often couldn't control their own paychecks, had limited divorce options, and had no legal protection against marital rape. This isn't about romanticizing Vikings or condemning America. It's about understanding that women's rights are constructed by law, culture, and social choices, not by some inevitable march of progress. The Viking women gave women economic and legal rights because it made practical sense for their society. 1950s America restricted women's rights based on ideology about gender roles. Both societies made choices. Neither was inevitable. The lesson? Rights are won through struggle, maintained through vigilance, and can be lost through complacency. The Viking women who ran estates, led expeditions, and wielded real power eventually lost those rights when society changed. The American women of the 1950s who fought for equal rights expanded freedoms that we benefit from today. History isn't about the past. It's about understanding what's possible. If Viking women could own property 1,200 years ago, then property ownership isn't naturally a male right. If Viking women could divorce freely in the year 900, then easy divorce isn't a modern corruption of marriage. These rights have existed before. They can exist again. They can be expanded. The next time someone tells you that women's equality is unnatural or against tradition or too modern, remember the Viking women with their keys, their wealth, their independence, and their power. Remember that tradition is whatever we choose to honor. And remember, progress isn't guaranteed. It's fought for every single day.